often I hear groups being referred to as cultural groups or ethnic groups. That's not correct. Best term is ethnic minority. That's not widely used in Australia, but that's my preference as a Ray person. And finally, does the researcher acknowledge that cultures are not static? Studies proposed for a point in time may need to consider the historical context of whatever is the subject of the research. And in this context, I was quite interested to see that part of the revision of the national statement also says that vulnerabilities are not something that are an intrinsic part of individuals or communities. They stem from circumstances and contexts, and they exist on a continuum for all research participants. Research merit and integrity. The question here is, how does the researcher conceptualize difference? Now, historically, many cross-cultural researchers have used a binary model based on simple oppositions, for example, first world, third world, Western, Eastern, developed, developing, modern, traditional, individualistic, collect, to illustrate differences. The binary model has been critiqued on the grounds that it narrows our ability to determine the scope of a problem, and it locks us into one perspective. It leads us to believe that societies and communities are homogeneous. It blinds us to complexities and contradictions within communities and societies. It can lead to false comparisons or false dichotomies. It entrenches the status quo and often posits, maybe indirectly, that one group is inferior to another. And this is part of what we call the deficit model. And it creates barriers between groups of people. And this is the culture conflict model, which is often used in cross-cultural studies. So the question for me would be, does the researcher propose any viable alternatives to this binary model? Linked to the models are, what is the terminology used to define and distinguish different groups? Now, whoever wrote "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," hadn't really thought of how language can be used to hurt people. That's part of the whole literature on bullying and racism. And I think a more contemporary view is the position we take, that language reflects and preserves the values and prejudices of society. And it is a very powerful means of perpetuating inequalities. So some terms which are openly pejorative are first world, third world. These have a historical background, but third world nowadays is often used to describe anything that's considered to be of the lowest common denominator. And it doesn't, it's not exactly good for the confidence of the people coming here who are supposed to be from the third world. There are potentially pejorative terms such as modern, traditional. Traditional tends to imply that these societies are stuck in some kind of time warp. They don't have the capacity to move forward. They can be backward. And the same goes for ethnic cultural groups, put in layperson's term, these funny people with funny names and difficult accents. The reality is that all societies actually have elements of modernity and elements of traditionality, and they're continuously moving in different directions. And there is a lot of anthropological literature showing that many societies are modernizing through changing their traditional structures. They don't unthinkingly adapt everything from Western societies, which are often presented as the model of modern societies. And I've already spoken about socially constructed categories presented as biological reality, for example, black and white. Again, there's a lot of literature, and the ABS does not use these terms. It uses the different categories of ethnicity, and I think that's a much better way of going about it. And then there are terminologies which are very confusing. One is culturally and linguistically diverse, because it sort of puts in one box people from Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And these are very diverse populations. And quite often when they are used as the point of difference, if you unpick what's being said, they're referring to people who are part of the visible minorities. They're not referring to Europeans. So I'm sure Australia will come up with a better term one day, but at the moment, I think the terms used in the UK and USA, ethnic minority, is a better one. I put Western in because, again, that's presented as a monolith, and there's a huge diversity. But some countries like Spain and Portugal don't fit into the individualistic, collectivistic model, and that again there is some discussion on it, not a lot. But I'm just trying to give an idea that the language structures how we think about things, and sometimes we have to really think about what is the language, what is the terminology we're using. And there is an acceptable exemption when certain terms are used to study political movements. For example, Black Lives Matter. There is also quite a good journal called Third World Quarterly, and they do explain why they use that particular term. It's really to look at similarities, but also to provide a platform for debate, discussion about movements forward. Coming on to research merit and how am I doing for time gone? I think I'm. How are differences in language and cultural constructions of reality to be resolved? There are some real ethical issues with the use of family members and friends as interpreters. Australia has a very good system of accredited interpreters and translators, and they're the ones to be used. There are some fields where the use of generic interpreters and translators isn't sufficient, and mental health is one area where the concepts cannot be readily transferred from one language, let's say English, to another. And researchers have had to work their way around that. There is, again, some pretty good literature of the innovative ways in which they do it. The research team, who's in it and what's their role? There is always the vexed question of cultural appropriateness, who speaks for whom, and this is where the whole issue of partnerships come in. And there is the question of what is the position of people from minority groups within a research team? Are they regarded as the cultural expert or the professional? Because usually they're the professional, or are they regarded as both? And I find sometimes that when we look at the roles and responsibilities, that spells out quite clearly what the roles are. And it's one way of deducing. The literature review is another one, that how well does it reflect different views, particularly those which contest dominant culture views, and dissemination. What's the plan when the language of the researcher differs from the language of the subjects of research? Justice, how are the participants recruited, and is the reluctance to participate due to culture or to other factors? There are a lot of ethical concerns raised about potential exploitation of participants from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and one person has even said they should be excluded totally from being enrolled as research subjects. I think it's better to have some checks and balances, because there is research being done on interventions which may be of benefit to low socioeconomic background. So to leave them out totally isn't going to answer the issue. Under respect, there are two concepts I'd like to discuss. One is that of cultural relativism. Now, this simply means that do we accept a particular belief or practice because it is part of the cultural makeup of a community? And the answer is no, because that contravenes the law within Australia. It also contravenes human rights principles. And in other countries, we can't take it for granted that they always support it. There are many countries which have similar laws, similar principles. How well these are implemented is a different issue, but the national statement is very clear that when we go to study people in other countries, it's the same principles that apply to the researcher. On the converse side, there is cultural reductionism, when behaviors, practices that are due to wider ranging structural social factors are reduced to a person's culture, and that is often used to marginalize particular groups. area of domestic violence, child abuse has a lot of this, where services are not provided on the grounds that, well, it's part of their culture and we shouldn't be interfering. Um, that's not correct. And if you talk to community leaders, they don't always support that either. These are assumptions that often underpin a lot of research. Privacy and confidentiality, we've already heard that there's different legislation and different in different jurisdictions in Australia. It becomes more complex when we go overseas, and many countries don't even have a privacy legislation. So the researcher is going to have to find ways to work around that. The confidentiality is an interesting one because it's quite clear in Australia, but what happens when you go to another country? And one researcher wrote that she learned in one project that it takes a whole village to answer a question, and she just had to accept it because it wasn't done for one person to be sitting and answering the survey that she had handed out. The decision-making ability, again, it depends on language and cultural differences. Here, agree that information sheets are far too long, 20 pages, particularly if your English language proficiency in Australia is not that great. So short, sharp, and it was very interesting listening to the talk on alternatives to paper-based consent, the whole e-consent, and those are things to look into.
Indrani, your time, I'll give you another minute.
Okay, well, that's my last slide anyway. So what's the way forward? It's resolution, not retribution. So some suggestions. One is active participation, and that's the title, nothing about us. Be specific. Instead of using a generalized term, use very specific, and use names preferred by the participants. Use participants' preferred conceptual frameworks. That's, deficits versus strength-based, and cultural negotiation rather than culture conflict. And respect culture-specific data collection methods. And I'm done, Gordon.
Thank you, Indrani. That was a great summary of aspects that ethics committee is required to. We don't really have time for questions, but I just will point out to the audience that, as Indrani says in her bio, managing diversity is part of her everyday life, and her extended family currently embraces 6 major religions and an equal number of language groups. So Indrani, you're obviously uniquely qualified to make comment on this, and clearly you do a great job for us on the UQ Ethics Committee and essentially walking the talk. So thank you very much for your presentation, and I think we'll probably move on to our next speaker.
Thank you.